Hello everybody and welcome to part 30 of Kerbal Space Program. The journey continues and we're straight into the action, blasting off from the KSC with one of our Brunel Mark II rockets. Last time we left our new interplanetary craft in its new parking orbit, ready to go. Well, almost ready to go. We still need 2 crew members and a little bit of fuel. On the case then we have Jebediah, Corkin and Gwenby Kerman. Corkin and Gwenby will be the 2 final crew members for this mission, and Jebediah will be taking them up and coming back alone, although as an experienced pilot I'm sure he'll handle that just fine. For this first mission today, we are taking up one of the 36-ton fuel tanks full of fuel and oxidizer mix, and that is just to make sure our Eve spaceplane, our Eve landing and return vehicle, is fully fueled and completely prepared for its mission. And the fuel we've got should just about cover it, so after that our lander will be ready for action. Our destination vehicle is in a high orbit, 1,000 kilometers above the surface of Kerbin, and that's quite far to go, especially when you're carrying this much fuel. So we're going to utilise some of the tricks we used when we had to go and rescue the Galileo when it got stuck in a high orbit above Kerbin on its way back from Moho when that ran out of fuel. Basically, we're keeping that second stage a little bit longer, and we're keeping that third stage a lot longer. We're going to use that to align our orbits and also to perform the first part of our rendezvous manoeuvre, that first burn to raise our apoapsis up to meet with our interplanetary craft, where we can kill our relative velocities, and well, you know how it goes. Something goes a bit wrong with the time warp here. We overshoot pretty badly, so we have to get rid of that third stage quickly, brake, match our relative velocities, and then start heading towards our target. This ESM and its payload is going to take a while to catch up with our interplanetary craft, so we use this time to switch to that third stage, that autonomous third stage, and we burn to lower its periapsis until it's on a collision course with Kerbin, just to make sure we've taken care of any potential space junk there. After a bit of faffing around, our crew finally arrives at our new interplanetary craft, and we can start to bring ourselves into dock. Now, on one of our new vehicle's docking ports at the moment, we have a drone core attached, so we're going to come in, dock that side, just so we can take that down. We don't need that anymore. That was just to keep the vehicle stable whilst it was unmanned, and potentially even to perform some manoeuvres if we needed it. With docking out of the way, we can begin the refuelling. Now, this is a little bit fiddly. Most of the fuel tanks are pretty full. They're just missing a little bit, so we have to click on a lot of them, top them up. The transfer rate isn't great, but we get there in the end. Our lander also needs a little bit of monopropellant, so we spare what we can from the CSM. We get the 2 crew members transferred across, and then it's time for Jebediah Kerman to head home alone, taking that little bit of fuel, the fuel tank, and of course that drone core, back to burn up in the atmosphere. Heading back to Kerbin, our Delta V situation is looking pretty healthy, so I decide to have a crack at landing close to the KSC. We don't do too badly, splashing down just off the coast of our space centre, the first of our refuelling missions a success. Our transfer window to Eve is rapidly approaching, so there's no time to hang around, so we launch another Brunel Mark II rocket on our second and final refuelling mission for our new interplanetary vehicle. Valentina takes charge for this one, and she is joined by Bill and Bob Kerman in what is pretty much a repeat of the previous mission, only instead of fuel oxidizer mix, we are just taking up liquid fuel. It's the interplanetary craft itself which is the focus of our attention, and we just need to make sure that is absolutely full to the brim with as much fuel as we can stuff in there. Again, we should have more than enough fuel to finish the job that we're going up for. When I was raising our craft up to its parking orbit, I was worried about how much fuel it was going to use, but it didn't use anywhere near as much as I had feared. It's performed quite well so far in the fuel efficiency stakes, which does bode well for this mission and indeed for any future missions we might be using it for. Once our crew reaches space, it's very much the same routine as last time, just keeping hold of that third stage and using its fuel to conserve the fuel of our CSM and allow us to reach our interplanetary craft in its 1,000-kilometre orbit. Incidentally, as I'm sure you've all noticed by now, this is once again a slightly shorter than usual episode. It's just that as I was planning out what I wanted to do for this video, I noticed there was kind of a nice and obvious narrative break before we got to the full 15-minute mark, which I normally like to do as a minimum, so We're just going to call this a slightly shorter one than usual and hopefully be back to something a bit more regular length next time. Back to the mission, and there's no time warp mishaps this time around. We get rid of that third stage, we perform our velocity matching manoeuvre before we close that distance some more and bring ourselves into dock. We're just going to leave that third stage where it is for the moment. We'll sort that out a little later. With our payload securely attached, we can start moving some fuel. This is a much less complicated job. It's just 2 large fuel tanks which need filling up. So we get that fuel transferring across, and with that, our craft is ready to go. Well, nearly. There's one more mission we need to launch to take care of something else, but the fuel is sorted. Is what I'm trying to get at here. Having obsessively checked this craft to make sure there's no possible way we could cram any more fuel in, we switch to our discarded third stage just to make sure that's going to deorbit properly before we switch back to our new interplanetary craft, because there's just one more thing I want to take care of this mission. This craft's name. In keeping with the naming convention of all of our other interplanetary craft, we are going to call this one the Copernicus. And with that done, there's nothing really more for our Kerbals to do. Valentina and co say farewell to their comrades, wish them well on their voyage to Eve, and start making their way back down to Kerbin. Following on from the last mission, I decide I'll have another crack at landing near to the KSC, but we've got a lot more spare payload fuel than we did last time, and that kind of screws our Delta V, so in the end we just have to come down wherever fate takes us. We come down in Kerbin's grasslands, the soft dawn light gently illuminating us, and with that, the Copernicus is nearly ready to rock and roll. There's just one more mission we need to perform. So the checklist is nearly complete. All the hardware's up, all the fuel's up, all the crew is up. But as with my other interplanetary missions, we're not going to leave them empty-handed in the case that something goes wrong. To that end, we have launched our space plane, and in the cargo bay are 2 of the Kerbal inventory system containers full of spare parts, just in case something does go seriously awry. Kerbal inventory system, as well as Kerbal attachment system, as those 2 mods kind of go hand in hand, are 2 of the mods we're using for this series, and if you haven't got them already, they're well worth a look. Allow you to sort of like make alterations to your craft in flight and all that stuff. I'm still nervous about taking up any kind of payload with this craft, even one as tiny as this. As I've mentioned on numerous occasions, this vehicle will need bulking up before we take up any kind of significant payload, which might not be this series now. We'll have to see. But anyway, our crew of Jebediah, Jeblov and Barbers do admirably get a good ascent and soon find themselves in orbit. We've still got about 2,200 meters per second of Delta V at this point, which means we don't really need to worry about the fuel situation at any point during this mission, which makes a nice change. Those Lanta engines burning very efficiently, if a little less powerfully than the burn time indicator seems to think they do, which is kind of irritating. It's been something of an ongoing issue, but I've kind of learnt my lesson now, so when we start to perform our rendezvous burn as we're approaching the Copernicus, I start burning a lot earlier than the burn time indicator would suggest, and that appears to work well. We arrive at the Copernicus without any problems, although we are in the dark. We'll just bring ourselves into dock first, and then we'll worry about time accelerating into some daylight. We've parked at a slightly odd angle just so we can get access to the cargo bay, and it's Barbas Kerman who will be doing the honours on this particular mission. I'm not sure how strictly necessary this mission was, although I did put the attachment points onto the ship to begin with, so it kind of makes sense that we get those containers up there. Plus, with this episode's runtime, I'm not going to say no to another mission, and I do like some of the shots we get as Barbas Kerman ferries these containers over to their respective attachment points. With everything in place, Barbas Kerman makes his way back to our space plane, and Jebediah and co start to make their way back down to Kerbin, leaving behind a completely ready-to-fly Copernicus at long last. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have any Delta V issues, so we can just plot a course back to the KSC without worrying about any further complications. We get a good descent. We do get a bit of a wobble on the way down, but that's just what happens when you're flying a space plane, really. And before too long, we are touching down safe and sound back on the runway at the KSC. And with everything sorted on our new craft, there's only one thing left to do. A few days later, then, we find ourselves back here in orbit with the Copernicus. it's very nearly time to make the transfer burn, so I suppose we'd better get that planned. Once again, we're using Alex Moon's KSP Launch Window Planner, very useful tool. If you fancy a look, I'll put a link in the description. We don't get an encounter showing straight away, but we just have to perform some minor adjustments before that starts showing on the map view, which is a nice change compared to some of the torturous experiences I've had just planning out some of these other missions during this series. Our closest approach will be a little far out, but then we were always going to have to do a correction burn of some description at some point, so best not to dwell on that too much. So it's time to prepare our craft, now fully fueled and with that mission vehicle attached to the front. This is a very heavy, lumbering beast. It's incredibly slow to turn. We've got no choice but to take this steadily, but eventually we do get this thing pointing in the right direction. And then it's just a case of waiting for the moment when we can open up those throttles all the way. The time arrives, we light up those 3 massive nuclear engines and begin our 21-minute burn. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this performs on the way back, because, the lander alone is going to be going down to Eve at about 100 tons and coming back at about 20, so hopefully some performance improvements there. With our burn complete, we go to the map view to see if we've got an encounter already, and we don't, which was kind of inevitable with a burn that long, but there we go. So we start to plan out a correction manoeuvre. It's 100 meters per second or so of delta V. We've got plenty, it's not much of a worry. And with that, we finally do have an encounter. I keep burning just to see how close I can get us to the planet, but then I remember, as I said earlier, we're going to have to perform a correction manoeuvre anyway. This is kind of pointless, so we just leave things as they are, and now we are on our way to Eve. With that, we have launched our final mission of the series, although this mission will arrive back long before our mission to Dres. I think before our mission to Dres even gets to Dres. So there's that. We're into the home straight, but there's still a little while to go yet. So finally, a few days later, we find ourselves here in orbit with our space station, the Socrates. Our science lab is once again full of science, and I'm quite desperate to pad out this episode a little bit. So we're going to get that transmitting back down to Kerbin. The science, that is, not my desperation. As I mentioned in a previous episode, this science is probably just going to sit in the bank for the moment, awaiting any potential future series. We've got no uses for it at the moment, but with that transmitted down, that will be all for today. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. If you have and you haven't already, please consider liking, subscribing, maybe even following me on Twitter, link in the description. Next time, well, we don't have a lot else going on, so I imagine we'll be following the Copernicus as it arrives at Eve, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.